Well, today we're going to talk about one of my, well, let's say not so favorite vehicles. And I can understand why people appreciate them, but this is not one of my favorites. And I'll say why. This is a 1987 Chrysler Fifth Avenue. And before we get started, let me just say that I do own an M-body Chrysler. These are off the M-body platform. I have a 1983 Plymouth Grand Fury, so I am an owner of an M-body Chrysler, and I enjoy that Grand Fury a good amount, but there's just a few things about these Fifth Avenues that I don't find overly pleasing. Now, the first is this front end with the inverted headlight turd signal look. The Chrysler started with the LeBaron that came out in the late 1970s, and it looks funny, and it's just not right in terms of the front end to my eye. So that's the first thing that I get distracted by when I look at these M-body Chryslers, I have to say. And as we rotate around to this rear three-quarter view, we can notice a couple things about this M-body Chrysler. First of all, I will say the M-bodies are very similar to the F-body Chryslers, the Aspen Volare. It's really what they were based on. And they had a few differences in terms of the underlying underpinnings, but they're very, very similar. It's basically an Aspen Volare. In this case, it's been gussied up. And one of the things that Chrysler did on the Fifth Avenue to disguise that Aspen Volare kind of profile and also differentiate the Fifth Avenue from the Dodge Diplomat and the Plymouth Grand Fury, its M-body platform stablemates, was this rear end treatment and the backlight. Now, you notice that these all have the have-to pay vinyl roof out back here, and that's because that the roof line is modified by a fiberglass plug that basically goes over top of the normal sheet metal roof line to create this more formal backlight. And I have to say, I am not a fan of the have-to-pay vinyl roofs. I actually don't mind a lot of vinyl roofs when they're full vinyl roofs, but this have-to-pay look that looks like it's kind of sliding off the back of someone's pate just doesn't quite look right. It just looks kind of funny. And I don't know why Chrysler thought that this cap would be the right answer. I think they were just trying to look for a relatively cheap way to give the car a differentiated roofline. And this was something that was somewhat popular during this time frame, shall I say. Chevrolet Caprice also had this fiberglass cap on it, and Chrysler had used it before, even on cars like the fuselage-era Imperials. They had a cap over the backlight to give it this kind of Frenched-in, more intimate look versus the Chrysler vehicles, and to disguise the fact that that backlight was really shared and between the Chrysler and Imperials. So it wasn't the first time that Chrysler employed this technique, but I think it's one of the least handsome, I have to say. I will also say that it's clear this is not a 1988 or 89 model, which would be the penultimate and ultimate years, respectively, for the Fifth Avenue, which was launched in 1982 as the New Yorker Fifth Avenue. We'll get into a little bit more of that in a second. But you can tell this is not a 1988 or 89 version because the vinyl roof was redone in 1988, and it would terminate lower than the belt line. Notice here on this 1987 model that the vinyl roof terminates really right at the belt line, and I have no idea why, but in 1988, Chrysler revised it. You can see the inset there, so that the vinyl roof would terminate below the belt line. I think it's made it even more unattractive. It just looks strange. Why is the vinyl roof terminating at that point? I have no idea. You also note one of the issues that I think with these vehicles, that is the fuel filler door is rather low. If you're a tall person and you're filling up your car, you're not going to stoop down to the level that you had to, let's say, when there was the center fill tank on some cars in the 1970s, like the Lincoln Mark IV, where you really got to bend over. But this fuel filler door is relatively low on these Fifth Avenues. And how did the Fifth Avenue come to be? Well, the Fifth Avenue was actually a trim line that was introduced on the R-body Chryslers, the larger bodies, in 1980. It was the upper end trim, and you got this really cool Fifth Avenue script in the rear window, or the rear quarter glass, I should say, more specifically. And then for 1982, it became an M-body Chrysler, and it was called the New Yorker Fifth Avenue. And it was, again, a trim package on the New Yorker. Well, then in 1983, Chrysler had an elongated K car that was named the New Yorker. So they had to say the New Yorker Fifth Avenue for 1983, and then eventually they would drop the New Yorker. I think it was just confusing to people. Why is the New Yorker a K car? Why is the New Yorker Fifth Avenue, an M-body, rear-wheel drive car, totally different vehicles and platforms. And by the way, this was the last rear-wheel drive V8 powered Chrysler that they made until the Chrysler 300 came out in the 2000s. So this was kind of the last of the dinosaurs in terms of V8 powered rear-wheel drive luxury. And I just have to say there's something, I don't know, unpleasant to my eye about the Fifth Avenue styling. It's got a very tall greenhouse, which does give you a lot of headroom on the inside, but they've got this kind of fake air extractor behind the front wheel. Then you've got the inverted headlamp turn signal up front. These wire wheels the fake wire wheel covers, I should say, that on the Chryslers just appear to be the most unconvincing. The front overhang is rather large. The overall styling and surfacing on the car just doesn't appear very crisp to my eye. And that rear cap with the altered roofline, it's not a happy design from my standpoint. I think my 83 Grand Fury is much cleaner. It doesn't have that cap, doesn't have those fish gills behind the front wheel, it doesn't have the inverted headlights. I think it looks a lot better. Still not the prettiest car, but it's not offensive. This Fifth Avenue to me, and I know that there's probably viewers who disagree. Put a comment in the comment section on what you think of the Fifth Avenue. I just don't think it's an overall attractive design. Now, on the inside, I have to say the Fifth Avenue was generally pretty comfortable, and this car has the Kimberly cloth interior option, these button tufted seats, and you could get Kimberly cloth or Corinthian leather. That was your choice in the Fifth Avenue, and they had that from the start all the way through the end of production in 1989. And you can see this has the two-spoke wheel. This was a revised steering wheel that came up for the 1987 model year. Along the way, they would make some revisions to the steering wheel. I don't think this one is an unattractive design. The 1989s would get the airbag wheel. This is not an airbag wheel. It does appear large, but does not have an airbag in it. 1987 will also be the last year for the super deep pile carpeting that you see in this particular Fifth Avenue. And it would also be the last year for something on the instrument panel that we will transition to now. And that is that 1987 will be the last year for the silver faces on the HVAC and radio control, as well as the light panel there and beneath the vent. I think that what happened is for the 1988 model year that the overall instrument panel is basically the same as the Diplomat and the Grand Fury, including the gauges. And Chrysler just thought, well, it's probably costing us incremental dollars to have these silver faces, and probably nobody notices, and we'll just eliminate it. And a similar revision was made to the turn signal mechanism back in 1985 to make it black versus color key to the interior, which it was before that. So if you're going to get a real Fifth Avenue, you got to get a 1987 or a bit earlier model, because then you get the true Fifth Avenue trimmings. By 1988, 1989, you started to lose a little bit of that. I think as Chrysler had some cost cutting. Some interesting little quirks and idiosyncrasies about these cars. When you turn the key on, of course, the oil pressure light comes on. Almost all of them have an obstruction in front of the oil pressure light. There's just a defect in that particular readout that seems to come to fruition in all of these Fifth Avenues, as well as the Grand Furies and the Diplomats. And the HVAC control is a really interesting one. It has buttons that you would push in and depress for the vent or bi-level or heater setting. Very standard, nothing much to do about that. But the cool thing was that if you wanted to operate the vent, you'd basically push in the button for the air conditioner and then you pull it back out. There was a little tang on the button that kind of helped you pull it back out. Now, interestingly, there was no tang on the defrost button, but you could push it in and the air conditioning compressor would engage, as it does most of the time in the defrost setting on cars. And then you could actually pull it back out and it would disengage, and you'd still have the air blowing out the defroster, but you wouldn't have the air conditioning compressor running. So that wasn't supposed to be a feature of the HVAC, but it did work that way. And by the way, if anybody's having trouble with their Fifth Avenue or Diplomat or Grand Fury and the airflow is not coming out the right door, it's not coming out the heat or the vent or the defroster, behind the trim panel underneath the steering column, you'll often find that there's this large connection of vacuum hoses for the HVAC. They all go into this plastic connector, and for whatever reason, even on my low mileage Grand Fury, my 1983 Grand Fury has 10,000 miles on it, that plastic connector just disintegrates over time and it like crumbles, and then it has a huge vacuum leak and then it just doesn't work anymore. And thankfully, the solution is very easy. You just get a bunch of little T's and you connect the vacuum lines up manually, and you basically get rid of the connector, and then you've restored the system functionality. And the systems on these functions relatively well. These are semi-automatic climate control systems. What I mean by that, you control the fan speed, you control the mode door, it controls the temperature automatically. So during this time frame, some of the automakers were starting to get away from the fully automatic climate control. Oldsmobile would be another one. They had the Tempmatic system as opposed to Comfortron, which was fully automatic. And I think what was happening is it was part of a cost reduction move. You could say that it was semi-automatic climate control. And people were generally happier. I don't know that customers enjoyed that the HVAC system was selecting the mode door on its own. I think in some cases they wanted to select the mode door and even the fan speed. So it was a little bit of a win-win. The customers got more control over what they wanted, and the auto company saved a little bit of money. So I think net actually made sense to go through that revision. And before moving on, I'll just say that for whatever reason, Chrysler transitioned in 1985 to this black gear shift knob. Prior to that, it was a chrome knob that I actually think looked better and never had an issue with it. It was the same knob, that chrome gear shift knob, all the way back even on the fuselage era Chrysler. So it had been used for a number of years, but I guess Chrysler thought it was time for a change. Now let's switch to the rear door panel. Why am I showing you a door panel in this Fifth Avenue? Well, this is kind of the last of the super old school, let's say, door panels. As the 90s would go on, this would change a lot. But notice you've got the carpeted lower, which I wish cars had today because you just get all these scuff marks. This was genius, but of course it costs money, and so it's gone. You have the puddle light down there too, which is nice. But then you've got the fake wood trim that is kind of all over this on the ashtray door. You also have an ashtray door too. Got to have an ashtray in every door so that everybody can smoke. And you've got the casket handle door pull. That's what that's called. That it swings out when you pull on it, and you are able to close the door with that. And like I said, this is kind of the last of the era for this particular style of design. And you've got a similar style door in the front. I will say that one thing that's different here is you'll notice that the power window switches are interestingly all in a line. Usually they're kind of arranged 2 by 2. Here they're 4 in a row, and the power lock switch is behind them. And then the mirror control is on the front edge of that overall control panel. So a little bit of an interesting layout. I suspect that Chrysler was trying to keep the overall legroom and hip room to a maximum, and so they didn't want to make the door panel wider. And so they just had this single bank of switches as opposed to having them arranged 2 by 2. Now let's take a moment to look under hood. And like any Fifth Avenue for the 1987 model year, this Fifth Avenue is powered by Chrysler's 318 cubic inch V8. And it depended on the year, but these made usually around 130, 140 horsepower. Not a lot of horsepower. They're a little bit boggy. They've got decent torque, but they're jetted very lean. This was kind of a variant of the lean burn setup, and you notice it's got the computer box on the side of the air cleaner with the vacuum diaphragm and the vacuum hose going to it. So this was really a riff on Chrysler's electronic lean burn that began in the 1970s, though it was admittedly more reliable. Although, like I said, Chrysler clearly put the computer for this under hood, and I don't know that that was the best choice. GM, for instance, would put it in the passenger compartment. Here, this thing is, getting exposed to all these heat cycles. The underside of that computer box is insulated, but still, it's an adverse environment for a computer to be located in. Now, when the Fifth Avenue, or I should say the New Yorker Fifth Avenue, was launched, you could get a Slant 6, the Tower of Power, in your Chrysler New Yorker Fifth Avenue. But after beginning with the 1984 model year, all you could get was a 318. And the Slant 6 in these, while very reliable, was just extremely slow. The 318, I would say, is no powerhouse. Certainly at freeway speeds, if you're trying to pass anybody, it takes some time, let's just say. Around town, it scoots around just fine. But the 318, I will say this about it, absolutely legendary, reliable Chrysler engine. And yes, there are some issues with that revised lean burn setup, but the engine itself, the 318, is a stellar Chrysler V8. And the transmission of these, the torque flight transmission that came in these Fifth Avenues was also just a stalwart. So you've got a really reliable engine and transmission. If I had to say anything about the weakness in the drivetrain, it would be the rear end on these, which was a very small rear end that Chrysler put in these. And let's just say you don't want to be on ice, where the surface is transitioning to ice and the wheels are slipping and then all of a sudden gripping. These rear ends are not very stout in these cars, unless you got a police package version, for instance. So something just to be aware of. They won't really fail in normal driving. There's not enough power with the Slant 6 or the 318 to do that, but you do want to be relatively gentle. These were Chrysler's lightest rear ends in any rear-wheel drive car. And of course, up front, you got the love it or hate it torsion bar suspension, though by this point it was transverse mounted torsion bars as opposed to longitudinal torsion bars, and leaf springs out in the back. And I have to say that if you drive one of these cars, while they seem a little large when you're looking at them, they kind of drive like go-karts if you're used to driving 70s era cars. They handle really well. The bodies don't lean. They are a stiff ride, I would say, relatively speaking. These are not plush mobiles. They are softer than, let's say, modern-day rides in many cases. But for the time, especially when you compare them to Ford vehicles, they're pretty stiff. My Grand Fury, my 83 Grand Fury, I would call it a stiff ride. Not unpleasant, but just not overly cushy. So something to be aware of depending upon what you like in your cars. And so there we have it. My take on Chrysler's Fifth Avenue, at least the 1987 version of the Fifth Avenue. Not really my favorite car, but hey, if you want one, go get one. They're not bad cars overall. They're quite reliable. Like I said, the 318, yes, there are some ignition issues or the spark control computer issues in some cases, but overall, just a great engine, great transmission, reliable vehicles, and, they're fun. I don't think that they're all that great in terms of styling, but, I'm sure some of you enjoy them. And I can't say they're bad cars. I mean, these were police vehicles in various variants, mostly Diplomats and Grand Furies, and taxi cabs as well, and they really just did well in service. Now, interestingly, if you want a tidbit of information, if you got a police vehicle, and it wasn't just a regular old, let's call it detective's car, it would have reinforced striker plates in the rear so that the criminals couldn't kick the doors out. And that is absolutely true. But you won't have that on the standard civilian versions, nor will you get the 4-barrel carburetor that the police variants got. You would just get the 2-barrel carburetor, the Carter or the Holly, depending upon the year.